Story 1. Lars Matank, German tourist who vanished in Bulgaria, 2014. I knew something was wrong the moment I realized the trail I was following had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind through the pines, nothing but an oppressive stillness that felt almost deliberate. Lars Matank had arrived in Bulgaria that summer as just another tourist, curious and meticulous, always noting the smallest details in his worn notebook. He was traveling alone, wandering the remote villages and mountains north of Sofia, drawn to places that most foreigners barely noticed. I first heard about him from the hostel owner in a tiny village called Lakatnik, a place hemmed in by cliffs and shadowed valleys, where cell service flickered at best. Lars had checked in with a polite smile, speaking enough German and broken English to be understood, and then disappeared each day, exploring paths that locals avoided after dusk. The first warning came when Lars didn't return for dinner. The owner shrugged and said, "Sometimes he likes to walk along the cliffs. The wind is strong there." I didn't think much of it at the time. He was a young man, confident and careful. But the next morning, the notebook appeared, left on a table outside the hostel, pages fluttering in the chill breeze. Inside were sketches of the cliffs, jagged lines that trembled slightly, as though drawn by a hand that was already afraid. There were also small, cryptic notes. They watch from the shadow. Keep moving. Don't look down. I traced the route Lars had apparently taken on a map later that day. It was an unmarked path, narrow, snaking up the cliffside like a vein through rock. When I visited, the air had a strange weight to it, like walking underwater, and the forest around the trail was unnervingly quiet. Every footstep on the brittle leaves echoed sharply, too loudly, as though announcing my presence to something unseen. The deeper I went, the colder it became, even though the sun was climbing toward noon. And then, I found the first clue that made my stomach tighten. A small German-made camera, half buried in moss, lens cracked but still warm from the morning sun. The battery was long dead, but the lens had captured a faint reflection, something blurred, darker than shadow crouching between the trees. I kept walking, following the trail Lars had described, and the path began to twist in ways that didn't make sense. The cliffs, I realized, weren't just vertical. They formed natural alcoves, tiny caves that seemed almost carved for someone, or something, to hide. Then the sound started, faint at first, a soft scraping against stone like fingernails or claws. It moved around me, never fully in front, never behind. My skin prickled. Every instinct screamed to run. I wanted to call out, but my voice seemed swallowed by the windless air. Night came faster than it should have, a sudden shadow that crept from the valleys below. I found a small ledge to sit on, heart hammering as the darkness thickened. The moonlight caught on something strange ahead, a figure, hunched and still, staring. Or maybe not staring. It didn't move like a human. My mind refused to process it fully, and then it vanished, leaving only the whisper of the wind. Or was it a voice? "Keep moving. Don't look down." The same words from Lars's notebook. I never did find him. The authorities in Bulgaria later filed the case as a disappearance, a young tourist lost in the mountains. Search parties combed the cliffs, checking every cave and crevice, but Lars Matank was gone. The locals avoided the area after dark, muttering about ancient rocks that remember and shadows that don't sleep. But the strangest part wasn't that he vanished. It was the trail he left behind, subtle changes in the forest, as if someone had brushed against every leaf, flattened every patch of moss, leaving a faint signature that only the most careful observer could notice. And the feeling, that oppressive weight, that whispering warning, it didn't disappear. I returned months later, curious, and the silence was just as complete, just as wrong. No birds, no wind, only the faint scent of wet stone and something older, something that had been watching long before Lars arrived. Sometimes when I think about that trail, I imagine what he might have seen. The slow shifting of shadows that aren't cast by the sun, the walls of the cliffs bending impossibly. The sensation that the forest itself is alive, aware, waiting. And I realize the worst part is not knowing whether he's out there, trapped in a place beyond comprehension, or if he's been absorbed, I never went back after that. But every time the wind in the trees carries a certain hush, I feel it again. That same cold weight. The faint echo of movement just beyond sight. And the whisper, always the whisper, keep moving. Don't look down. Lars is still out there, somewhere in Bulgaria. And some nights, I wonder if he's the one who left those scratches on the stones, or if it's something else entirely, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander too far. Story 2. Bobby Dunbar. Child identity mix-up and missing boy, 1912. Never should have heard the story of the boy who vanished from a Louisiana riverbank that summer. Something about it made the hair on my arms stand on end, even decades later. It was 1912, and the Dunbars were a quiet, well-meaning family living in Opelousas, Louisiana. 4-year-old Bobby was their pride, a small, wiry boy with a mop of dark hair and eyes that seemed older than his age. That morning, like any other, Bobby had wandered off near the Mississippi River, chasing a dragonfly or some imagined creature only he could see. Hours later, after frantic searching and mounting panic, he was gone. The river, which had shimmered in the sun moments before, seemed to swallow him whole. His parents' cries carried through the sweltering Louisiana air, but there was no answer, no sign of the boy. Weeks passed and the town grew restless. Flyers were posted, neighbors scoured every path and hollow, and rumors drifted through the humid streets. Some said they saw a shadow of a child on the banks at night. Others whispered that the river hadn't truly let him go. Then, 8 months later, a boy was found in Mississippi, living with a family who insisted he was their son. Lost Bobby, they called him, though the resemblance was uncanny. The Dunbars, desperate and broken, claimed him. The child, confused, quiet, and fearful, was brought home. But even as Bobby smiled and hugged them, a chill lingered in the air, subtle and insistent. Something was off. At first it was small things. The boy would stare at corners of the room as if expecting someone to emerge. At night, his breathing was irregular, almost like he was holding back panic. And sometimes he'd mutter a name no one recognized. Mrs. Dunbar noticed that when Bobby played outside, he didn't run like other children. He lingered, watching the woods and river with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Yet neighbors and family alike were desperate to believe. Any suspicion felt like treason against hope. As the months stretched into years, the unease deepened. Bobby began to remember things no one had told him. Details of a house he had never lived in, a dog that didn't belong to the Dunbars, a mother he had never met. When pressed, he would stiffen, a wild, panicked look in his eyes, and whisper that they're still there, watching. Mrs. Dunbar tried to dismiss it, blaming nightmares or imagination. But even she could not ignore the way the boy would recoil from certain rooms or hide when strangers arrived. It was as if some invisible hand tugged at him, a memory of something he couldn't fully recall. One late summer evening, the Dunbars hosted a small gathering. The windows were open, letting in the heavy river-scented breeze. Children laughed outside, but Bobby stayed on the porch, staring into the darkness that swallowed the edge of the property. Mrs. Dunbar approached him, lightly brushing his hair from his forehead. "Bobby, it's just us," she whispered. He flinched, eyes darting to the tree line where shadows pooled like ink. Then, in a voice small and strained, he said, "They don't belong to you. They'll take me again." No one else heard it. Or if they did, no one commented. The party moved on, laughter masking the cold knot that twisted in Mrs. Dunbar's stomach. But that night, long after the guests left, she awoke to the sound of soft weeping, coming not from the bedroom, but from the kitchen. She found the boy standing by the back door, staring blankly at the river that shimmered under the moonlight. His small hands trembled as he whispered again, "I don't belong here. I never belonged." Years later, when Bobby had grown, the story resurfaced. DNA tests long after his death suggested the boy returned to the Dunbars may not have been their son at all. The boy found in Mississippi had lived in the grip of another family's life, yet carried the Dunbars' identity as if it were stitched into his very bones. The truth was impossible to untangle. What haunts me most is the thought that the boy who returned, Bobby Dunbar as the world knew him, was aware from the beginning that he was not who he was supposed to be. That all along he carried the memory of a life that did not belong to him, and perhaps the shadow of those who had claimed him. Sometimes on quiet nights, I imagine the river whispering, carrying secrets that no one can quite hear. And I think of Bobby, standing on the banks, caught between two lives, his small voice still trembling in the humid Louisiana air. I never belonged. The chill never left. And maybe in some way it never will. Story 3. Walter Collins, Boy Switched, Changeling Case, 1928, L.A. I never expected the stranger at our doorstep to smile and call me Mom. That smile stayed with me long after the boy disappeared. It started one humid morning in 1928, when my husband and I noticed our 10-year-old Walter hadn't come home from school. At first, we assumed he was playing in the alleys behind our neighborhood in Los Angeles, the city still a patchwork of dusty streets and shadowed corners. But as hours passed and night fell, an icy dread settled over our little house. We called the police, posted flyers, and searched every block ourselves, but Walter was gone, vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks. Every knock at the door, every shadow in the street made my heart leap, only to settle in disappointment. Then one afternoon a boy appeared at the police station claiming to be Walter. He matched his height and general appearance, and he knew basic facts about our family. Relief washed over us, a fragile hope that maybe this nightmare was ending. Yet something was wrong. The boy's eyes, dark and restless, never lingered with recognition. He couldn't remember small details, our dog's peculiar habits, the sound of his own favorite lullaby. When I tried to hug him, he flinched as if my touch was unfamiliar. My husband and I shared uneasy glances, but the police, eager to close the case, insisted he was our Walter. We brought him home, trying to reclaim normalcy, but every evening felt like a rehearsal for dread. At night, the boy wandered the halls silently, staring at the walls, muttering fragments of words we couldn't understand. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed through the empty rooms. I would awake, heart pounding, only to find him sitting by the window, staring into the darkness as though listening to something I couldn't hear. I began noticing small inconsistencies. He refused my favorite recipes, insisted on sleeping in a different bed, and sometimes called me by another name, a whisper that vanished when I demanded he repeat it. When I pressed him, he would look at me with eyes that weren't my son's, and I felt a chill creep down my spine, the unmistakable sense that I was living with a stranger masquerading as my child. The police returned occasionally, questioning our patience, but when I mentioned my fears, they dismissed them as trauma-induced confusion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly off. One night, I followed him as he crept through the house, drawn by the soft shuffle of his feet. He stopped at the hallway mirror and stared at his reflection. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as though the light itself recoiled from him. He whispered my name again, and this time I heard it clearly. Margaret. Why do you look so strange? Panic surged through me. I recoiled, but he smiled. Not Walter's timid, bright smile, but something sharper, calculated, as if he were testing me. Mom, he said, stretching the word into something twisted and unfamiliar. That moment cracked the illusion completely. My husband tried to soothe me, but I could see the same doubt creeping into his eyes. Our home, once warm and familiar, became a cage of suspicion and fear. Weeks later, I went to the police station again, demanding answers, convinced that the boy was not Walter. That's when the truth, or a fragment of it, hit me. The real Walter had been found drowned in a nearby river days after the boy had appeared. The authorities had withheld the body, fearing public outrage. The boy we had brought home was an imposter, a child who didn't belong anywhere, yet had slipped into our lives as if drawn by something dark and deliberate. I never learned where he came from, or why he chose us. Some nights, I would wake to the sound of his soft breathing near my bed, even though he slept across the hall. I would see him in the corner of the room, pale in the moonlight, eyes glinting with a knowledge he shouldn't have. He would whisper things only Walter could have known, memories that weren't mine to give. We moved eventually, hoping distance would sever the invisible thread connecting us to that boy. But I still see him sometimes, in passing shadows, in reflections where nothing should be. I hear the hollow echo of his laugh in the streets we once called home. And I know, in some dreadful, unspoken way, he is still out there, waiting for another family to mistake him for their own child. I never should have opened that door. Story 4. Kayla Reed, woman missing 11 months, came back changed, 2008, Canada. I remember the first time I saw Kayla Reed after she returned. It wasn't the missing girl I'd known. Something in her eyes made the room feel colder, like she had brought the darkness back with her. Kayla had vanished almost a year earlier from her small hometown in Alberta, Canada. One day she was walking her dog down Maple Street, and the next, she simply wasn't there. Her disappearance was covered in every local news channel. Volunteers searched the forests and abandoned buildings, but no trace was ever found. I was just a teenager then, living a few blocks away, but her vanishing had left a shadow over the neighborhood. And then, exactly 11 months later, she came back. Her arrival was quiet. Nobody saw her walking home from the edge of town, not even the police who had kept an eye out. One evening, a neighbor spotted her standing outside her old house, staring at the street like she had never left, but somehow already far away. Her hair had grown wild, tangled with bits of dirt and leaves, and she smelled faintly of damp earth. At first we all thought she had been lost in the woods, surviving somehow. But there was something else, something wrong that no one could put a finger on. I was one of the few who dared approach her. She didn't smile, not once. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost hypnotic, but it carried a hollow resonance, as if her words were echoing in a place we couldn't reach. She didn't talk about where she had been, and when pressed, she only shook her head and whispered, "You wouldn't understand." It wasn't evasive. It was a warning. The change was subtle at first. She avoided sunlight, spending hours in dark corners of her home. She stopped answering the phone. Her parents tried coaxing her back into normal routines, school, old friends, but she refused. And then the dreams started. Not her dreams, but ours. Neighbors reported strange noises around her house at night. Soft, uneven tapping on the windows, like fingernails drumming in some invisible rhythm. Some said they heard her singing in a language no one recognized, a low melodic chant that carried across the empty street. People in town swore that on certain nights they could see shadows moving behind her curtains, shadows that didn't match her shape. Even the dogs reacted violently when passing her house, growling and pulling their leashes as if the very air had turned dangerous. One evening I decided to see for myself. I waited near the edge of her yard, hidden behind a cluster of pines, listening. The night was still, almost suffocatingly silent, until I heard it. The soft, dragging shuffle of feet across the living room floor. Kayla was there, pacing, her head tilted strangely, as though listening to something only she could hear. Then she began whispering words that chilled me to the bone. I didn't understand them, but the tone was sharp, deliberate, like commands. A part of me wanted to run, but something kept me rooted, trembling in the shadows. Over the next few weeks, the town's unease grew. Kayla never left the house during the day, and at night the neighbors said they could hear her moving, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing, but always alone. One of the local kids swore they saw her standing at the edge of the woods, watching them with eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. My friends laughed it off at first, but the fear was real. Something about her wasn't human anymore, or at least not the person we remembered. I visited her one last time, under the pretense of checking in. She answered the door silently, her expression blank, her eyes hollow. I tried to speak, but my words caught in my throat. Without warning, she reached out, almost touching my face, and whispered, "You can't stay." The air between us seemed to twist, heavy and suffocating, and for a moment, I felt like my thoughts weren't my own. I turned to leave, but the sound followed me. Her low, melodic chant carried on the wind, repeating over and over in a language I didn't understand but felt in my bones. By morning, Kayla was gone again. No one saw her leave. Her room was empty, but the darkness lingered. Faint scratches on the walls, a faint smell of damp earth, and a chill that wouldn't lift. The town tried to move on, but nobody forgot. Some nights, when the wind howls through Maple Street, I swear I hear her voice, faint and hypnotic, whispering from the shadows. "You can't stay." And I know somehow she hasn't left at all. She's still out there somewhere, changed, watching, waiting. And if you ever hear her whisper in the dark, don't respond. Because whatever she brought back with her, it's hungry. Story 5. Connor Hastings, teen abducted and returned with strange notes, 2017, California. I still remember the exact moment I realized Connor wasn't the same boy who walked out of our house that morning. His eyes, they didn't blink the way they used to. Connor Hastings was 15, quiet, and a little awkward. The kind of kid who carried a notebook everywhere, scribbling comic book ideas. On a Friday afternoon in late October 2017, he left our home in Modesto, California, saying he was going to meet a friend at the corner store. That was the last time anyone saw him, at least for the next 2 days. The police search was intense but fruitless. Flyers covered lampposts, social media posts were shared thousands of times, and neighbors joined in with flashlights and worried murmurs. Every sound of a door closing or car engine made my heart jump. Then, like some cruel trick, we got the call. Connor had been found wandering on the outskirts of an industrial park, about 15 miles from home. He seemed unharmed, physically at least, though his clothes were dirty, and he smelled faintly of damp metal and something acrid I couldn't place. At first, relief washed over us, but it didn't last long. Connor was different. He spoke less, moved slower, and carried a small bundle of folded papers he refused to let anyone see. At dinner that night, he quietly set them on the counter, avoiding eye contact. His mother, trembling, asked him about them. Connor only whispered, "They told me to write it down. They said you needed to know." Curiosity gnawed at me, but the papers remained untouched for hours. When I finally dared to look, the handwriting was childlike but uneven, almost shaking. The notes were filled with short, disjointed phrases. Don't look behind the doors. They watch when you sleep. The quiet is hungry. The walls move. I'm not alone. At first I thought they were nightmares written down in panic. But then a day later we discovered more. A series of tiny scratches along the wooden door frames of his bedroom, too precise to be accidental, forming shapes we couldn't identify. Connor claimed he hadn't done it. Sleep became impossible. At night, I'd hear him muttering under his breath, repeating parts of the notes. Don't look, they watch. Quiet is hungry. Sometimes the whispering seemed to echo from the walls, a dry, metallic rasp. I started checking the house constantly, doors, windows, even closets, but everything was normal. Physically normal, yet every time I turned a corner, I felt certain someone or something was just out of sight, watching. It was during the third night after his return that I realized this wasn't just trauma. Connor was leaving me notes now, tucking them under my pillow on the bathroom counter, even in the mailbox outside. Each one more disturbing than the last. They told me to leave it here. You'll see soon. The face is quiet, but it smiles. It waits. I asked him where he got them, and he stared at me blankly, shaking his head. I can't explain. They're not people. Not like us. Then the sound started. At first I thought it was the wind, the house settling, but there was a rhythm to it. Soft scratching from the walls, almost like fingernails. Sometimes a faint creaking that sounded like someone walking just behind me, always stopping when I spun around. Connor never reacted. He would sit in his room, staring at the wall, humming quietly, the same notes scrawled in his notebook. One night, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I opened one of his papers to read the most recent note. It said, "Tonight they come closer. Watch the shadow by the window. Don't blink." I laughed nervously at first, trying to dismiss it as imagination. But when I looked toward the window, I froze. A shadow lingered there, impossible to define, yet unnervingly still, taller than any person, and yet wrong, too rigid, as if it had no joints. The air grew cold, sharper than winter's bite, and I could hear it. Almost a whisper, but it wasn't coming from Connor or anyone else. Something outside, or maybe in, was breathing with a patience that felt eternal. Connor didn't react. He just watched me, eyes wide and empty, holding a pencil and scribbling furiously on his notebook. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused. When I blinked, the shadow was gone. I checked the window, nothing. The street was empty, silent. The next morning, the papers were gone. except for one left on my pillow. It read, "You blinked." They know. To this day, Connor's behavior remains off. He doesn't speak of where he went or who they are. The notes have stopped for now, but every so often I'll find one tucked somewhere, on the kitchen counter, inside a shoe, or under a stack of mail. Each one reminds me that whatever took him isn't gone. It's patient, watching, waiting, and maybe now it's watching me too. I don't know if anyone would believe this story, but I know the truth. Connor Hastings came back, yes, but not entirely. Some part of him stayed there somewhere, and it left a message for us all. Story 6. Maura Murray, nursing student vanished after car crash, 2004, New Hampshire. I remember the exact moment I realized something wasn't right. That feeling crawling up my spine when the woods seemed too silent. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't belong in a forest, the kind that waits. Maura Murray had been a bright, ambitious nursing student. Everyone at the college in New Hampshire knew her as friendly, reliable, the kind of person who could light up a dorm hallway with a smile. But in the winter of 2004, something about her life twisted just out of sight. Something small at first, almost imperceptible. It started the evening she left. Her parents remember her being unusually quiet over the phone, brushing off their questions about why she was traveling alone during a snowstorm. Maura's plan was simple: drive home from her college in Burlington to see her family in Haverhill. Just a few hours, but somewhere along Route 112, in the remote stretches of northern New Hampshire, her path disappeared into the dark. Witnesses later reported seeing her car, an older Saturn, half off the road, tires sunk in snow, smoke curling from the engine. Oddly, it seemed abandoned at first glance, yet the driver's door was ajar. Inside, a few belongings remained: textbooks, a wallet, a phone with a cracked screen. Nothing more. No footprints led into the forest, no tire tracks beyond the road. It was as if she had simply vanished. Sheriff's deputies combed the area, flashlights slicing through the cold mist, but all they found were signs of someone walking carefully, deliberately, away from the crash. The deeper they went, the thicker the silence became, almost oppressive. Search dogs refused to enter certain stretches of the forest, noses twitching, ears perked, then retreating as if repelled by something unseen. Locals later said the woods were different at night, that the air itself seemed heavier, almost viscous. I spoke with a few people who were near the site shortly after the crash. One trucker mentioned seeing a girl walking along the shoulder, coat zipped tight, eyes wide with that strange blank stare people get when they're lost, or worse, when they're being watched. She didn't wave or call for help. She just moved, slow and careful, slipping into the shadows like a whisper. Another hiker claimed he heard her singing softly to herself, a nursery rhyme, though the air was frigid, and no child's voice should carry that far. Weeks passed. Posters went up. The internet buzzed with theories, some logical, some insane. But nothing concrete emerged. Yet the unease lingered, especially for those who drove that road after dark. Drivers reported fleeting glimpses of a figure by the roadside, standing perfectly still. Head down, hair dark against the snow, just standing, watching, and then gone. The strangest part is how ordinary everything seemed until it wasn't. Maura's life before that night was normal. Friends, school, a bright future. But sometimes, the normal masks something else, a creeping void that can open in a single instant. In her case, the crash, the abandoned car, the silent forest, they weren't the horror themselves, but a threshold. Something about that road, those woods, changed the rules. Years later, investigators still puzzle over the details. Some theorize she left intentionally, trying to escape pressures or expectations. Others think she wandered into the forest and succumbed to exposure or accident. But every scenario has holes. Her bag was packed with essentials for a short drive, but not for survival in the freezing wilderness. She didn't seem distressed enough to run, and yet she never returned. People familiar with the area warn outsiders not to linger at night. They describe a certain pause in the air, a stillness that grips your chest, a whisper just beyond hearing. I've driven those roads myself, careful to keep the headlights sweeping, the engine humming. But even in the warmth of the car, there's a moment when the woods feel alive, like they remember. And in that moment, you realize someone, or something, is moving just beyond your vision, watching, waiting. Every winter, friends of Mora gather, lighting candles, leaving flowers at the roadside. They hope for closure that may never come, and sometimes, when the wind shifts and the snow crunches underfoot in just the right rhythm, they swear they hear a soft singing, carried from somewhere deep in the forest. The melody is familiar, almost comforting, but wrong, like a memory twisted out of shape. No one has seen Maura Murray since that night, and maybe that's the cruelest part. She's gone without a trace, yet she lingers in whispers, in the pause of the wind, in the way the dark forest seems to hold its breath whenever someone passes. You drive that road, and for a heartbeat, you're certain you're not alone. And then you glance at the edge of the trees, and for a moment you think you see her, a dark shape, still, watching, waiting for something no one can name. Some questions have no answers. Some disappearances leave echoes that stretch far beyond the event itself. And some roads are best left untraveled when the sun goes down. Story 7. Rick Hill's Alaska Disappearance and the Watcher, 2004. Nome, Alaska. I remember the exact moment I realized something wasn't right, when the snow outside seemed almost too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That stillness felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was watching. Rick Hills had lived in Nome, Alaska for most of his life. By all accounts, he was an ordinary guy, late 20s, quiet, kept to himself, and worked as a mechanic at a small garage near the outskirts of town. But in the weeks before he vanished, Rick began leaving his usual haunts, walking along the icy shores of the Bering Sea alone, muttering about the Watcher. His friends dismissed it as stress, the paranoia of someone who spent too much time in the isolated Alaskan wilderness. It started with strange notes. Rick would leave scraps of paper around his apartment, scrawled in messy handwriting, "I know you're out there," or "Stop watching me." At first, they were brushed off as a joke, but the tone grew darker over time. He stopped answering calls, ignored messages, and withdrew completely. Even his cat, which he adored, began to hide when Rick was home. On a frigid February evening in 2004, Rick set out on what would be his final walk. According to his neighbors, he bundled in heavy winter gear, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and disappeared into the falling snow. Nome was already a town carved from isolation, but that night, the wind howled like it was carrying whispers, scraping against wooden houses and frozen windows. People didn't think much of it. Alaska's winter nights were long and harsh, but something about that night felt off. Weeks later, fragments of his story began to emerge. Rick's car was found abandoned at the edge of town, engine still warm, keys in the ignition, as if he had simply stepped out and vanished. No footprints in the snow led away from the vehicle, which was impossible given the fresh snowfall that had blanketed the ground overnight. Local search teams combed the area, but there were no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain his disappearance. Then there were the calls. His friends reported receiving strange voicemails from Rick's phone. The first time it was just heavy breathing. The second, a low, almost guttural whisper repeating the phrase, "Don't look." Authorities confirmed the calls came from the area near his apartment, but Rick had been gone for days. Each attempt to trace them failed, the signals disappearing into static as if the air itself was swallowing them. Rumors began circulating about a shadowy figure, an entity locals quietly called the Watcher. People described seeing it lingering in the tree line at dusk, unnervingly still, watching houses, streets, even isolated hikers. Some swore it had no distinct shape, a silhouette that blended with the darkness, but its presence carried an undeniable weight, a sensation that something alive, intelligent and utterly malevolent was observing every movement. Rick's journal, found months later by a neighbor who had been cleaning out his apartment, was the most disturbing clue. The entries were erratic, ranging from mundane observations to frantic sketches of dark shapes looming near windows and doorways. One page simply read, "It's learning. It knows when I blink. I can feel its eyes on me through the walls." Another entry ended abruptly in jagged, nearly illegible letters. "I can't, don't look behind the curtain." Some say Rick may have wandered into the wilderness himself, lost and disoriented. But for those who knew him, it didn't make sense. He was careful, methodical, the kind of man who planned for every eventuality. Disappearing without a trace, in a town he knew like the back of his hand, didn't fit his personality. On the anniversary of his disappearance, a few locals claim the Watcher returned. They report seeing lights flicker in Rick's old apartment, shadows moving against the walls, and faint whispers in the wind carrying fragments of his last recorded words. Dogs howl in the night, eyes wide and ears pinned, fixated on corners where no one stands. And some nights, when the snow is thick and silent, hikers swear they can feel someone, or something, following, keeping pace just behind them, always watching, never seen. Rick Hills has never been found. His case remains open, a cold file in a town used to isolation and hardship. But anyone who listens closely to the wind across Nome's frozen streets knows the story doesn't end there. Sometimes late at night you can almost hear him in the whispers warning you, don't look. And if you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan snow, and the silence feels too heavy, too complete, don't turn around, because out there in the shadows, the Watcher waits.